So we are really lucky to have Rod Hamilton with us today, the Chief Product Officer and one of the founders of Culture Amp. He's also been, I would call you a long-time StartMate mentor now, Rod. You're kind of approaching your fourth or fifth cohort.
Yes, that's right.
So Rod's been a StartMate mentor for a while now, and always a very highly rated StartMate mentor. Typically kind of makes it into the top 3 or 4 spots based on the voting from the founders at the end of each program. So super excited to have him with us today. We're going to talk about a whole range of things. The main theme being kind of the origin story of Culture Amp and where it started. And we'll talk through some things like early customers, early product, how they even came up with the idea. And we will leave plenty of time for questions. I really want this to be a session that's kind of driven by what you're interested in as the audience. So if you have questions, don't be shy. Please throw them into the Q&A function and we'll triage them as we go through. But let's kick it off. So Rod, super lucky to have you here with us today.
Thanks for having me, mate. I appreciate it. It's always good to have a chat about these sorts of things. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, awesome. Well, look, I thought we might start by rewinding all the way to the very beginning of your journey, which probably feels like quite a while ago now. And we spend so much time, and we see it in the press all the time, hearing about the kind of amazing success of Culture Amp and where you're at today. But at StartMate, we spend so much time working with founders that are right at the very beginning of their journeys. And with the kind of level of success you've reached, you don't often hear the origin stories of a company like Culture Amp too much. So I'd even just love to start with, how did you get the idea for Culture Amp and how did you start the company?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for noting how long ago it was. Yes, I was a little bit younger when we started Culture Amp. So it's about 11 or 12 years almost now since we started Culture Amp. So, I mean, my background prior to Culture Amp was in enterprise tech. So I did study computer science at university, and back in the day, I was actually on the tools and coding and that sort of thing. And I always say I wasn't actually a particularly good engineer. So I was always the engineer that was kind of thrown between the development team and the business. So it was very much my job to try to sort of make sure that the thing that we were actually building was going to solve a real problem for the customers that we were working with. And I did actually spend probably, I think it might have been like 12 to 15 years in consulting and enterprise tech sales, working for the Telstras and the NABs and Transurban and all that sort of thing. But really, if there was a theme that sort of set me on the path for Culture Amp, it was that I worked on these tech transformation projects that so often it was like hundreds of employees, multi-year journey, tens of millions of dollars, and you get 1 year in and you would look up and you barely move the needle on the tech transformation, because it was never ever the tech that was the challenge. It was always the people and culture side of things that was a real challenge for these companies. So I think that was sort of the idea that the 4 co-founders of Culture Amp, so Doug English and John Williams, who I'd actually worked with on one of those big projects, and then also Didier Elzinger, our CEO, we rallied around this idea of like, hey, could we start a company that could build tech, but tech that focused on helping the people side of companies to be more successful. So yeah, we kind of met on the journey that way, and we had a few bites at the cherry to get something that worked. But yeah, it was just really rallying around a problem that we all really believe was worth solving.
That's awesome. Well, I can see a few names in the audience that I recognize from our recently graduated Founders Fellowship cohort. And one of the questions that they were grappling with at the time was 2 things. When you're deciding to make the jump into being a founder, how do you know you're solving the right problem? So how did you get conviction around that being something worth solving at Culture Amp? And the second is how you know you're doing it with the right people. So I'd love to kind of dive into that a little bit more. The first one being, you'd obviously recognize that people was a problem, but how did that actually translate into you getting confidence to quit your job and actually make that call and dive into solving that problem?
It's an interesting one, because it actually worked probably the other way around for me personally. And what I mean by that is I didn't really have huge ambitions to start a startup, like personally. It was actually, I met Doug and John as potential co-founders and worked with them, and it was more about like having conviction in the people that I was going to work on this with. So Doug and John met them on a couple of those big transformational projects. We built trust with each other. We liked how each other worked. We kind of felt like we were a pretty good team. So we'd been talking about starting something for a little while. Actually, they were already working on something, and they took a little while to wear me down. But then we met Didier along the way as well. And he was someone who was already working in this space already. He'd sort of been working on Culture Amp and the concept behind Culture Amp for a while. And for me, it was really just, that combination of both a team you can trust, so people you really want to work with, plus a problem or a problem space that I was super passionate about. So those two things coming together for me made it like the perfect thing to finally make the leap and jump into it. I still probably was a reasonably risk-adverse individual back then, so I needed a fair bit of pushing from my co-founders in the end. Probably a little bit of pushing from my wife and my brother to say, "Come on, Rod, get some courage and have a crack at this." But probably the thing that gave me the most, conviction was thinking through it and saying, just what is the worst that could happen out of this? If things go pear-shaped, worst thing that could happen is a year down the track, you go back to working for the man, you go back and ask for your job back, or if you've got a pretty good network, it's not that big a deal to be able to go back and ask for a bit of help. And probably just thinking back on it, I always felt like it was this really big decision of quitting my job and moving on, and it was going to be super scary. And as soon as I quit my job, it wasn't a big deal. Even when we weren't earning any money, we weren't getting any salaries or anything like that. But it just wasn't anywhere near as scary as what I thought it was going to be in the first place. So it played out quite well for me.
That's awesome. One of the things you shared, I think, with the cohort almost a year ago was an early screenshot of the first co-founder agreement that you had with with the three others. I'd love to dive into a little bit about how you thought about kind of getting on the same page with Rod, Doug, and Didier, and what crossed your mind when you're actually building that first agreement, and what was important to you right at the start.
What crossed my mind when we were building that? Probably the first thing that crossed my mind was, shit, these guys are very ambitious, because it was a pretty big plan. And I was sitting there going, in 12 months, we might be going back and asking for our jobs again. But that was the first thing that crossed my mind. I think people often ask, 4 co-founders, that sounds like a lot of co-founders, how do you deal with, disagreements and all that sort of stuff? I think we've been super lucky in that it's probably the combination of co-founders that really works for us. Even from day one, we kind of had Didier and I probably focused more customer product. John and Doug focused far more on engineering and building out the product itself. So I think we were just fortunate that we really complemented each other skill-wise. So it was about the combination. And it was probably also that we weren't, it wasn't like it was always 2 co-founders kind of pairing up against 2 other co-founders in our perspectives. It was a fairly good mix. So that's just work for us. But I think probably the key thing, and this comes back to just basic sort of team psychology and that sort of thing. The thing you have to go for early on is trust. And I think we did a bunch of things early on whereby, we set everything up to be as equitable as possible across the co-founding group. We actually just hung out a hell of a lot outside of work as well. So we had that real foundation of trust as a founding group. And then once you have that foundation, you can have arguments and you'll still be friends at the end of the day. And you're having those arguments because you're all sort of hurting for the same things when you're getting started. So that just clicked for us. So I think we were pretty fortunate in that respect.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't actually heard you mention the point around the difference in ambition before. Has that changed over time, or do you think that was it's still the case? It's interesting because some of the speakers we've had come in to talk to the accelerator, as well as talking to the Founders Fellowship, have kind of said the importance on being on the same page from an ambition perspective and making sure you're trying to build the same type of company. How did that play out?
It's interesting. How did that play out? I actually think it really helped us, to be honest, in some of those discussions and decisions that I was talking about earlier, because I think we had one or two of us was super ambitious in like, let's just take on all the projects. Let's just, and any customer, yeah, we can make it work for that 20,000 person company, when the platform only actually supported 200 at the time. And I was very much like, I was probably less ambitious. I was like, all right, if we're going to do this, this is what it means. We're going to have to think about X, Y, Z. So I'm probably that balance of ambition and then also, thinking through exactly what we'd have to do to meet that ambition helped us out. But yeah, I think it was probably a healthy blend. But I think over time, I'm definitely more ambitious now than what I was when we started. You kind of have to go on that path if you're gonna swing big at it. So it has helped, but I think it's probably helped in the other direction with a couple of the other co-founders as well. That sometimes when you do want to swing big at something, you have to sort of come to terms with the things that's going to mean to get there. So I think it's helped us overall.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure the challenge of, you were saying team psychology is really important at the start. I'm sure that challenge has only got more and more difficult as you've hired hundreds and hundreds of people and scaled internationally.
Absolutely. That's very, very true. And you're constantly building it, right? Because because your team's changing. My first team is sort of the executive team at Cultram now, but you're constantly bringing new people in and like trust is just the foundation of all of it.
Yeah, awesome. Look, I promised we would talk about early product. I could talk to you about how you started the company and how you built your relationship probably all day. But I would love to start diving into, once you'd identified this broader problem from some of these kind of organizational transformation projects you'd worked on, how did you actually then map that into your early decisions around product? What was your first product and how did you build it?
Yeah, okay. First product. So first product wasn't great, our first product. So we pretty much, if there was a book for how not to do it, we followed that well. We built our very first, so it was in the performance management space. So it was, in our swing zone at the moment. And what we were trying to do was we were trying to blow up the annual performance review and turn it into a much more continuous cycle for companies whereby they set up managers to help them be coaches. And it wasn't about doing a big annual performance review every year for each employee. It was just a continuous conversation. And we built that product out super quickly. We built it in a couple of months, 2-3 months. We had customers, like not paying customers on board, but we had teams using this product. We actually had reasonably good sort of retention, teams coming back and using it day in, day out. And we made our first sale a few months in. I still to this day like to brag that I made Cultram's very first sale. It was a huge $400 annual subscription for a not-for-profit. They never even signed into the platform, not even once. But they ponied up the cash. And then we probably 6 months in, we landed a reasonably big customer, and they loved the product. And unfortunately, I think that gave us a lot of hope to persist. And it was this idea that, we just need that one extra feature, or we just need to change that one thing. And with one good customer, the rest of the world will figure out that we've created a wonderful product. But it took us probably 9 months or so to figure out that while we could get users, we just couldn't get buyers. And we unfortunately didn't really have a business model. So that very first product was a bit of a dud overall. So we just couldn't get there.
How did you, it sounds like you had customers, a couple of them were paying, you had people signing in, although not the paying customers, but there were people signing in. How did you get to the point where you realized it was time to kill that product, particularly given that you put so much time and effort in and you had people actually using it?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was really reluctant initially to kill this idea. And I think it was because I'd spent so much time thinking about how the product would have helped me in my prior roles. And I was very kind of inside out in my mindset with how that product was working. It was actually like, for me, the thing that kind of tipped me over the edge was my brother saying to me, "Hey, Rod, like, how long do you want to spend all of your own money on something no one else is willing to pay for?" And it was just really bleedingly obvious. But yeah, all I can really say on that is, like, we didn't have traction And you don't know what traction feels like until you actually get it. And it was just so dramatically different with the subsequent products. But probably the key thing that we kept feeling was, while we could get, as you said, we could get customers on board, as soon as we got introduced to the buyer, which was really the key thing that we weren't able to do successfully, we'd get an introduction and they would see this as a big change management exercise for them. And they'd actually go to the point where they'd kind of shut the teams down from using it. So we very clearly didn't have the right relationship with the buyer. And once we came to terms with that, it became fairly straightforward to say, all right, we need to try and swing at something else. Also, we were running out of money pretty quickly, so that also helped.
Okay, that's a really interesting point though that you just touched on, and you mentioned it before, the difference between the buyer and the user. How did that then influence your thinking around the next versions of the product that you decided to build?
Yeah, pretty heavily, and it still does today, to be honest. Like when we think about what we're building, and it's a little bit of a challenge because if you think about what we're actually trying to do with Culture Amp and Culture Amp's business, we are trying to help companies be more successful by improving the behaviors of all the employees at work. We're trying to change culture, so that's fundamentally about changing behaviors, right? So even though we sell to HR as that they're the main buyer, we need to get managers on board, we need to get employees on board to use our platform on a regular basis and focus on improving whatever the company needs to improve to be more successful. I guess the difference with I guess it was actually the third product we built, but it's the kernel of what we have today, which is essentially an engagement survey platform. We really had to sort of validate before we started building anything that our buyer was interested in the problem we were trying to solve. So we took a fairly dramatically different approach to that first product that we built. We didn't do any coding. We put together, I think it was like a 5 or 6 page PDF document, which basically was a prototype of the platform that we were going to build. And we said to ourselves, I think it was over a 2 or 3 week period, we said, we're going to interview 20 CEOs or heads of HR. And if we can get 10 of them to sign a contract saying they'd buy this thing, then we would build it. So we're actually trying to sign up customers before we had any sort of product. And we didn't quite hit our numbers. I think we only interviewed 10, and I think we had 4 actually, sign up for it. But we rounded up and we cut ourselves some slack because it was the first time we had customers. We just didn't have a product, and we started building. But I think like that ability to get to the buyer and that willingness to pay was just critical in that early days. And now, we have to think about it when we build, even building features today at Culture Amp. We constantly have to think about, okay, if we're building something for managers or individuals, is this going to be relevant to the buyer as well? So it's just a big part of how you have to go about it now.
Interesting. I have quite a few questions on that point, but I'd love to understand if you didn't even have a product, what were you selling to these people and how were you communicating that? I mean, it's that classic, like, do things that don't scale. But if you don't even have a product that you can give them when they do decide to pay you and sign a contract, what was that process like?
It was reasonably intimidating, actually, because we were having to build very, very quickly. And as I mentioned earlier, I was a below average engineer, so I'm not that fast, but no, lucky I had Doug and John, who were very, very fast. But yeah, it just meant that you had to build only the absolute bare minimum essential things for the customers to be successful with the next step. So our very, very first version of the engagement survey portion of our platform, it was literally just the form that an employee fills out when you launch a survey to them. So it's basically a form with 50 or so questions on it. I was building scripts. I'd take an email from the customer with all of the employees' email addresses. I'd run a script that would send them all links. It was pretty ugly. And then the employees would fill out the survey. I would take an export of their responses, give them to our first employee at the time, Jace McPherson. He was our chief scientist. And he would put it into a stats program. He'd bash out some really ugly PowerPoint presentations, and then we'd go in and we'd present that to the customers. So we were literally like just 1 or 2 steps ahead of our early customers in terms of what they needed in the platform. The byproduct of that, though, was it was just an incredible way to learn what was important. We weren't funded. We were obviously bootstrapping at the time. So it was just essential for us to make everything that we built kind of count at that time. So working with customers this way, and rather than building a report, actually just taking them through a PowerPoint presentation, it showed us very quickly what concepts resonated and which concepts didn't resonate. So it actually worked incredibly well for us in those early days.
I think that's a really interesting point. Just don't build it unless you've got conviction from the customers through some scrappy way that it's actually something that they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'd love to talk a little bit more about the customer side of things then, and how you attracted customers and how you learned from them both in the early days and down the track. But maybe just focusing in on your kind of first 100 customers, was there a particular go-to-market motion you tried to pursue? How did you find these customers? Did they look the same? What was that process like?
Yeah. It's probably two things that come to mind with that. The first thing, and this is like for early stage startups, this is probably like, once you've got your founding team, this is probably my number 2 sort of piece of advice, which is like, just ask for help. And we found in those early days, like a big part of like the super early days, a big part of our go-to-market was don't sell, go and ask for help. So what I mean by that is like people don't want to be sold to. It's less about like, hey, I want to come and demo you my product. If you say, I'm part of this small startup, we're really passionate about this problem, we'd love to talk to you about your take on this problem, share your expertise, and then we'll share what we're learning with you. They pretty much always say, yes, we'll take that call. We want to talk to you, especially if you're talking about a problem that they're super passionate about as well. So one of our early day hacks was like, get on LinkedIn. We would go to San Francisco and we'd spend 2 weeks over there, and then we'd just get on LinkedIn. We'd look at any head of HR who's been in the role for 6 or so months. We'd send them this email and say, we're just in town for a couple of weeks. We want to learn. Can we show you what we're working on? And more often than not, the answer would be yes. They'll be super passionate about the problem. They would connect us with a bunch of other like community members or colleagues that they've worked with in the past, and they give us these introductions. And it worked incredibly well for us. So that first sort of piece of advice, like ask for help, don't try to sell too hard. Once you get that help, it often turns into a sale anyway. And then the second thing was, we were super fortunate that we connected with a startup HR community, which was actually an active community in the Bay Area back in the day. And through the community, there was a bit of a movement around the idea that we were trying to solve, if you like. And because we could latch onto that community, those, any community members would introduce us to other community members. And it was just a big part of how we could scale early on. So community was a huge part of our go-to-market.
Interesting. I'd love to double click on that. If you're open to it, this idea of building through community, and I think you started the People Geek movement. Yes. Was that an intentional part of the strategy? I mean, community is a bit of a buzzword today, but this was, I won't put years on it because you don't want to think about how long ago it was. But you're kind of ahead of the curve when it came to building through community. So I'd love to talk about how you landed on that strategy and how you actually implemented that in practice.
Looking back, I'd love to say it was really deliberate. I don't think it was totally deliberate when we first started it. So we established this People Geek community at the very start, and the way People Geek came about was we were trying to figure out what to put on a t-shirt on one of our early trips to San Francisco. What culture amp, we have to have a t-shirt. What do we write on it? We saw I think a guy with a new Relic t-shirt on that said Data Nerd. So we tried to do our version of it, which was People Geek. I absolutely hated it. I thought it was a terrible idea. And then we went and did this trip in San Francisco. We call them Geek Ups, which are basically meetups. And we'd just ask some of those people that we're asking for help from, and we'd try to bring them together at sort of in a social setting. And the the people we were getting to these events, they just really resonated with this idea of people geek. You know, I'm a people person and I like to geek out on data to figure out how to help improve the people side of work. And it just became this incredible growth vector for us, because when we weren't in the room, like we would create the space for these individuals to get together. But when we weren't in the room, they would continue talking about us. They would continue sharing their experience, not just with our product, but around the problems that we were trying to solve with the product. Like, I actually think it's an important point. Don't try to build a community around your product. Try to build a community around your problem that you're trying to solve. And yeah, this just became an incredible growth vector for us, because you could get some marquee customers on there. They would talk to their friends, and yeah, we built a lot of momentum behind the community. And then once we found that we had some traction there, we actually really leaned into that hard. And I think, you know, at one stage we were doing multiple geek ups every week at a different city and across the world eventually. And it just became this huge vector. And it was people believing in why we were solving the problem we were solving, not so much our product. And yeah, it really worked for us in those early days.
I think there's a few interesting points there around kind of building community to learn from them so you can build the best product. Did you, as the founders, focus a lot of your time in those early days in building community, actually running these geek ups, or what did you see that as like a really important early hire in the team that you needed to bring in?
So probably a bit of both in that case. So yeah, like we would always get a founder to one of the geek ups to either speak or host a panel or something like that. But we hired a guy by the name of Damon Klotz. You may have met him. He was our head of community, and he was awesome. Just super hungry, like all about building the community. And he was the guy that really put the foot down on the community, built a team around him. And you've probably, like, he's got awesome podcasts out there, and he's been able to interview the who's who in the well, not just the people and culture world, but yeah, it's something that founders definitely had to show that it was important, but we then needed to ask people to pick it up and run with it to really scale it for us.
Interesting. Now, this is probably a slightly selfish question, given StartMate's also a community-first business. But I'd love to understand, given the way you're talking about community, it sounds like there's really important links between the community part of your business and product development. And there's also then really important links between community and the go-to-market and the sales and marketing side of the business. How does that actually work in practice at Culture Amp? And has that changed over time? How does the community team make sure that those community insights filter to both those parts of the business?
Yeah, it's a good question. We'll probably go a couple of ways with this one. So the first thing is we try to get, like, when there's community events. I mean, it's interesting talking about this now, right? Because we haven't done any of these in-person events for a couple of years now. So I think things have changed a little bit more recently, but I always encourage our product managers, our designers, our engineers, all that sort of thing to get to these events themselves. It's not just about the community team being the ones who are hosting this. It's actually get people from all across the company to these events. From a product perspective, it's an incredible source of insight and feedback for us, not just on our product, but just around the problems. Because if you think about it, like, you've got the perfect blend of attendees at these events. Yes, you've got customers who are using the product, and once they know there's an engineer in the room, they'll make feature requests and all that sort of stuff, right? Or they'll give feedback on what their experience has been. You've often got people who are in the sales process at the moment. So they're prospects. They're people who know they've got this problem they're trying to solve. And the fact that you've got other customers in the room, not that typically helps with the sale itself, but you can actually learn what new customers are looking for. And then the third thing is you typically have people who are, they're not customers, they're not going in the demo flow, they're just potentials. And that's another source of research for our product teams, to ask questions for people who don't necessarily, they're not necessarily looking to solve that problem just yet. So I think, like, to get back to your question, how do you integrate that? Like, I think a big part of the way we approached it, at least, was to get everyone be involved in those events. It's not just something the community team runs. It's like get the engineers in, get the sales team in, get the marketing people. It's a great place to learn from.
So it's almost community becomes a company-wide responsibility that the community team facilitates rather than just the community team being responsible for it.
Yeah, that's a good, concise answer, Sasha. I like that. I'll use that next time.
Okay, cool. Glad that was helpful. One more thing on the customer front I'd love to dive into is I think in past conversations we've had, you said the first 100 customers or so, or the first bulk of your customers were the kind of SMB business size.
Yeah.
And then there was this point where you jumped into doing enterprise customers. And I think there was some really interesting insights there around how you made decisions about what product to build and why as a part of that journey. I'd love to dive into that a little bit more. And maybe you can just talk through what point in the journey was it that you started selling to enterprise customers, and then we can dive in from there.
Yeah, sure. So I think it must have been, it was probably a few years in, and like our sweet spot was fast growth tech startups up to probably 500 or so employees in size. And we built a really good, solid product for those sorts of companies. We didn't make a deliberate decision that we wanted to go after the big end of town before the opportunity presented itself. And it was actually one of our early customers, Adobe, who they contacted us pure inbound. I remember having the conversation with the co-founders, and John was like, "Oh, should I fly to San Jose and do a demo and chat to them?" And I was like, "Don't worry, this is that whole ambition thing." I was like, "Oh, I'm not sure it's worth spending the money on it." And then, John went and demoed, and I think he turned up to and anyone who knows John knows he doesn't quite love doing the public speaking and presenting. He walked into a room of about 30 suits and he did this demo and he absolutely nailed it, and they just wanted to work with us. So we sort of had to make this decision at the time, to be able to support Adobe, who they were about 15,000 employees at the time. To be able to support them, we'd have to do a fair bit to rebuild the product very quickly. I think we had about 90 days to rebuild the platform to be able to support them. And I think the thing that you're referring to was the decision process we went through in, do we continue to double down on the SMB and mid-market, or do we try to scale to the enterprise? It felt initially like it was this big, yes or no decision. Do we do this or do we do that? And one of the team, I can't remember quite who it was now, asked the question, well, what needs to be true to be able to do both? And what that led to was us just itemizing out a whole bunch of assumptions. Well, if we're going to be able to be successful with this needs to be true. This needs to be true. This needs to be true. And it just meant that we could get those assumptions, reality test them. And we managed to find a way whereby we could build out what was needed for Adobe, but actually make it really relevant for the rest of our customers and improve their experience in the process. Now, on the surface, it sounds like, why not do both, which is quite often a really, really bad advice. But it turned out for us to be a really pivotal moment in our growth, because, that we managed to support Adobe. They had a wonderful experience on the platform. And then they became this incredible marquee customer for us that really helped us actually lean into the bigger end of town over time. So it was kind of an interesting experience, but we didn't sit there and go, oh, we're going after the big end of town now. They came to us first, and then we had to figure out how we could make that scale.
Interesting. So it sounds like there was this quite clear, if you were going to build something for an enterprise customer, it needed to be relevant to the SMB 100%. Market that you're already serving. How did you then go about dealing with custom feature requests from enterprise customers? I mean, even working with StartMate alumni so far, the bigger customers tend to ask for quite specific features which might not be applicable. How do you actually manage those conversations and make sure you're building the right things and dedicating resources to the right things?
Yeah, it's still a challenge today, to be honest. Like it's an ongoing thing. Like Culture, we have some of our biggest customers are over 100,000 employees now as well. So when a very big valuable customer comes along and says, hey, we need you to build this thing, it has a fair bit of weight. But the risk that it has if you're saying yes to too many of those things is that it just whiplashes your roadmap from side to side, and it actually makes it very hard for you to remain the master of your own destiny and actually execute the roadmap that you need to. So my sort of my rule of thumb, if you like, is that most of the time you're actually saying no to feature requests. And the reason you're saying no to something is because you're saying yes to something else. Like every no is that there's a yes behind it. It's just a yes that hopefully is something that is more strategically important to you, and helps you remain on your own path. The one thing that I will call out though is sometimes you do, like especially in the early days, like you're looking at it, it's like I'm either saying, no to this and then I have no runway, or I'm saying yes to this and it actually produces a runway. So it's never a really simple decision. And sometimes it's totally fine to actually say yes to produce that runway. But it's just, you've got to be deliberate in how you make the decisions. That's probably the key thing there.
Awesome. As Bronte has just pointed in the chat, and she's politely kicking me in the ass to make sure we get to audience questions. I will jump onto the audience questions in a second. So make sure I'll ask a few more questions and make sure that anything that's on your mind, really open forum, throw them into the Q&A function. We'll get to them in just a second. And we are going to talk, there are a couple of questions I can see here about fundraising. So I will ask Rod some questions about fundraising versus bootstrapping and what that process was like in just a moment. But I would love to ask you one more question about go-to-market and what your early go-to-market was and what it is today. I mean, there's so many, you were talking about buyers before, and there's so many decisions that a founder needs to make about how to reach these buyers and how to sell to these buyers when they're in the early days of their company. What is Culture Amp's go-to-market motion at the moment? Is it product-led? Is it sales-led? Is it some hybrid? What is it? And how did that actually emerge?
Yeah, so good question. So, I mean, there's a bit of both in there, but like ultimately, we are selling to HR, and it's interesting. Like back in the early day, we thought like the whole approach that we needed to take was monthly subscriptions. We'll have zero touch sign up and onboarding, and it just did not work for the sort of business we were trying to build at all. Like HR is our buyer. They budget on annual cycles, so they think about their budget yearly. And we were trying to get HR to think about like doing month-to-month subscriptions, and it just didn't make sense to them. We actually had scenarios where we had new customers saying, "Oh, I just want to turn this on for a month and run a survey, and then I want to turn it off for the rest of the year. Can I just pay for a month?" Things like that. So it just didn't work. So I think definitely you need to think about your customers' budgeting process and their buying cycle. So that's changed over time. But I mean, I think like at the moment we are mostly sort of sales led in how we go through our go-to-market process. There's a salesperson will generate leads, a salesperson will get on a call, they will demo the product. And then, a lot of the onboarding process as well, once you make the sale, it's actually talking to someone at Culture Amp. And a big part of why we need to do that is a lot of what our customers are looking for is confidence early on that they're about to roll something out across the whole company. And they want to be confident they're not going to make a mistake. And actually speaking to an expert from Culture Amp is one big way of building confidence. That's not to say that we don't need to scale that. So there's different parts of the sales and the onboarding process that is a little bit more product led and more digital experience led. So I think that's a bit of a hybrid, and I think over time we'll probably see more and more of that be product led as well.
Awesome, that's so interesting. All right, I did want to ask a couple of questions about fundraising. There are a few questions in the chat. I think. Well, you mentioned you bootstrapped at the start of the journey, and it sounds like you bootstrapped for quite a while. Why? And what are the trade-offs in your mind between raising or bootstrapping?
Well, I can tell you why. It's an interesting thought process. Like, would I bootstrap for as long as we did again, given the chance? And the answer is probably no. We'd probably raise a little earlier, but like our experience of it, I think we were bootstrapping for about 3 to 4 years. And a big part of the why for us was early on, it was partly like the fear of losing control. Like, once an investor comes in, does that actually mean suddenly, you lose control of all the decision-making rights and it puts you on a certain path? that was one of the fears that we had. I think the other fear we had was, we're culture ant. We have to have a really super resilient culture, and we want to be in control of that culture as well. So we took a little while before we decided that we'd take money, but there were opportunities there to raise for sure. There were definitely opportunities, but it actually took a conversation that we had with Scott Farquhar, was one of our advisors in the early days, and I remember a particular, it was like a board meeting, if you call them board meetings back then, but he was sort of saying to us, hey, you have a product that your customers love. You have no clear competitors. We didn't really have clear competitors at the time. You've got a plan and clear blue water in front of you. Like it's time to put the foot down, because that traction, others will notice that traction in time, and other startups will come into the space. And that was when we raised our Series A with Valuation. And I remember not long after that, we started seeing a bunch of competitors pop up. So that was why we held off for a little while. Given the time again, I would probably raise a little earlier. And I think just some of the things that it allowed us to do. I remember my first thought when we raised was like, oh man, we can hire a security guy, so I don't have to fill out all those security questionnaires myself, right? It was like just little things like you can start to get specialists into the business who are really good at the sorts of problems you need to solve. Whereas up until then, it was a whole lot of generalists who are good at a bunch of different things, but it really allows you to lean into some more specific things you need to scale. So that's, that was a little bit of my experience anyway.
That's interesting, hiring the security guy so you don't have to do the questionnaires.
Yeah.
How did you tactically actually go about finding your lead investor for that round? Once you'd made the call, how did you go about raising the round, identifying who to raise from and actually going through that process? But also one of the questions here is what key metrics were important in those early capital raises? Was it market size? Was it your revenue? Was it a product metric?
Wow.
What was important? And I might be asking you
it's
to
super hard to remember.
Open the archives.
That's hard to remember that one, like the specific metrics. It wasn't a product metric for us back then, I don't think. But yeah, I mean, the process was basically, get over San Francisco, meet many investors, as many as you can, pitch. I mean, some of the early days we're pitching, and we had investors saying things like, well, why the hell would a company survey their employees and ask them for feedback? That doesn't make any sense at all. So, you've got to work through it until you find an investor that really resonates with the idea. And that was the thing about Felicis for us. We had, Iden and Wes Chan, and they really believed in the people and culture side of what we were trying to do. And I remember back then when we were raising, it wasn't that common for, Valley-based VCs to invest in Aussie startups back then. So I think the key thing for us was just finding that alignment again around the problem we were trying to solve, and they could see the opportunity that was in front of us. I mean, it certainly didn't help. It certainly didn't hurt that we had traction. We were growing pretty quickly, so it was quite clear what we were going to do with the money. But yeah, it was. I remember the investing process was for me. I found it really confusing the first time through. It was like read venture deals, get super confused, Google it, finally understand what it was that they were talking about, and then you'd have no idea if you actually were getting a good deal or not, right? And all I can really say that helped us was most of what we were told turned out to be true, and the best thing you could do was go and talk to founders and people who had been through the investment process, especially with the particular VC that you're going to strike a deal with. And it's about sort of deciding who you're going to trust, and lawyers are useful as well. But yeah, it was an intimidating process, definitely. But that's sort of how it played out for us.
And that building confidence that you were getting a good deal, was that, as you just said, built mostly just through talking to other founders that investor had invested in? Is that the kind of number one thing you would recommend to founders in the audience that are trying to suss out whether they're getting a good deal?
Yeah, I think that's probably the key thing. Like, pick who you want to trust and get advice from. I mean, it was an interesting process because, like, our VCs, that they would often, we would raise questions with them directly, and they would say, oh, look, you shouldn't worry about that. You should worry about this. And, you know, at the time when you don't have that relationship, you're not sure if you're getting the truth even. But I can certainly say in our case, it played out the way that, you know, it had been explained to us. So we're pretty fortunate there. But I do think that key thing is like, find a founder who's been through the process, pick who you trust. You'll always get different opinions as well, right? So you'll chat to you know, multiple people, but just try to pick the person that you can trust and focus on and run with that.
Awesome. There was a question here. You mentioned you would have raised earlier, probably, if you had your time again. Is there a clear point in your mind where you think, we should have raised at that point? Like, is there a milestone a founder should be thinking about to pull the trigger on raising? Or is it a bit harder to put a stake in the ground like that?
Honestly, it probably is harder to put a stake in the ground, because there were some big upsides to not raising as well, in terms of, you know, as we were trying to get to product market fit, like it forced us to do those things that don't scale and really learn about the problem we were trying to solve. So there's definitely some big upsides to taking a while to get there. So I don't think there's a definitive answer to that one for me. I think like probably one key bit of advice is just be really clear on what you're going to do with the money. like that's the thing. Like at the moment, anyone, you know, you can raise because you can at the moment, but I think you need to have a clear plan. And once you've got that clear plan, then I think it can flow from there.
Awesome. And there's one more question on valuation here, which is on fundraising here, which is around valuation, which is how do you actually get comfortable with valuation decisions, or how did you specifically for Culture Amp get comfortable around valuation and that side of the process?
Yeah. How do you get comfortable? I mean, I think like for the very first, I mean, again, it's probably about those conversations, talking to others and seeing what the market is doing at the moment. Like it's, you know, like right now it's a super frothy market, right? There's big valuations out there at the moment. So I think you need to, you know, chat to the right people to understand what the market is doing right now and what other companies at similar stages are able to raise at. I mean, early on, I think personally, I found that a lot harder. And what I would do is lean on the other founders more than anything. So, you know, Didier is the guy who does the vast majority of the fundraising for Culture Amp, and he's really good at it, which doesn't hurt. But I think it's that, you know, it goes back to that team and talking through it and kind of agreeing on a number that we'd be happy to run with, and then work from there.
Awesome. Well, look, we probably have time for one or two more questions. So if anyone else has a question, throw it in now. Otherwise, we'll run out of time. There is one in here from Lucy, and she sounds like she might be looking for a job at a company rather than founding her own. But from your experience at Culture Amp, is there one metric that's the best indicator of a workplace culture in a company? You know, what are the most important things that you've seen that actually contribute to, I guess, a quote unquote good culture?
Yep. There isn't one metric. It's definitely multiple metrics. And yeah, I mean, I can say that because our ultimately the thing that we measure at Culture Amp is employee engagement. And then what we do is we do a bunch of analysis to understand what is driving employee engagement. And, you know, typically the things that we see in our data that drive it, things like growth and development, like that's huge. And what I mean by that is like, typically what you'll see is in companies where an employee feels really positive about their growth and development opportunities, they are likely to feel good about the company. So they're likely to be proud to work there. They're likely to be committed to work there in the near term and the long term. They're likely to recommend that company, those sorts of things. So probably the thing that we see in the data more often than anything is that around growth and development. I think leadership vision, leadership communication, that often pops up as a really strong driver of engagement. If the leaders create a vision that motivates employees, they're highly engaged in their work. Very rarely do we see things like pay and benefits. It tends to be more of a hygiene factor, if you like. Once you get past a certain point, then it becomes fairly irrelevant as to how engaged employees are in their work. So there's not one sort of key metric, and it's a fairly complex system. People and culture, it's fairly messy. It's why we're in business. So yeah, I can't point to one thing, but I think there was another part of that question, which was like, what's the question? What's a question you would ask to get an understanding of the culture? And the thing that I sort of often come back to is like, ask the founders why they started the business. Ask them what's the problem that they were trying to solve. So I absolutely love it when I'm interviewing a candidate and they ask us why Culture Amp, why this idea and not another one. And I'll always ask that same question to a candidate who wants to come and join. And it's interesting what you'll hear.
Awesome. We've got a couple more questions in here. From a pricing perspective, you were talking about the transition of going from SMBs to enterprise. What did that actually mean in practice for your pricing? Did it stay the same? Was it per participant, or did you have total pricing? Was it different for enterprise or small business?
Yep.
What did that look like?
It's been an evolution, definitely. So, I mean, we basically, we price hopefully based on value. So, if it's bigger companies, more people getting value from it will tend to pay more, but it's a sliding scale. So obviously, like the per employee cost will typically reduce over time based on, reduce based on the size of the company. There is, product module based pricing as well. So, it's not just one product, you can add additional products to it. So we price based on that also. So it's a little bit of a mix. There's also some services and those sorts of things. So it's a bit of a complex process. But I think the simpler you can keep it in the early days, absolutely the better. The simpler for the buyer, like just make it easy for them to grok, easy to understand, and just let the pricing get out of the way. I think the thing that I think it was Ash Moira says, like, that the right price is the one that your customer reluctantly agrees to, something like that. But my advice in the early days is just keep it super, super simple.
Awesome. Two more quick questions on fundraising. So there's one question on fundraising around how taking on VCs limits your ability to make quick decisions on the fly. Did you find that when you took on venture investors? Was that a factor? How did that change the dynamic?
It didn't. Like, I don't think that slowed us down at all. In fact, like, we were worried about that, and that was one of those reasons why I think in the early days I said we took a little longer to take money than we otherwise could have. But I think in our case it's sped up decision making, because it's given us a bunch of like super intelligent individuals who can pattern match with what's happening in other businesses, and you can just go to them for advice essentially. We have not found, at least in our case, that it slows decision making down or actually even necessarily makes it harder. It's been a really really positive asset, if you like.
Awesome. And then staying on the investment track for our second last question, did you find it hard to find investors that understood your vision and value in Australia, or did you have to raise from US investors by necessity?
This feels like it's like quick fire now, Sasha, like we're going fast.
We got to get through them. We got to get through them.
So, I mean, I think it was just a function of the scene. When we first raised, there weren't that many Australian VCs playing in that space. So, I mean, early on, yes, we had a couple of Valley-based startups invest. But I mean, we had Blackbird was involved in our early rounds, and have always been, like, just phenomenal to work with, and that they led our Series C, I think it was. So yeah, I mean, the scene has definitely, it's a bigger scene now. There's more VCs that are out there, so it's a good environment to do it now. But yeah, the early days, it was just a function of, it wasn't done that often in Australia when we started. It's probably showing our age more than anything though, mate.
I'm sorry to have thrown so many questions in there, but
I
keep highlighting that point. Look, there's one last question, which I think is a really nice question to end on. Anya says here, thanks so much for sharing. It's been super interesting. Her question is, how do you see Culture Amp in 3 years? Do you have a particular vision for where you're going to be then?
Totally. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll say from a customer perspective, if you like. So we have built something that HR teams absolutely love at Culture, and the expansion, if you like, that we are making at Culture is like, if we're actually going to deliver on our mission and our vision at Culture, we have to reach managers, we have to reach individual contributors, and like that's the big thing that we're swinging at here. Is we want, Culture is going to be a platform that is not just for HR and leaders, it's going to be for all employees at work, and we're making a bit of a dent in that now. But I think like in 3 years, I hope we've really crushed that problem. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's a super inspiring note to end on.